Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this distinct expectation of precision.
Right. You want the doctor to be completely specific.
Yeah, precisely. Like, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line. The doctor just points at the screen and says, there is the problem.
It's clean, it's binary,
And
and it makes total sense to us.
yeah, you look at the scan, and the reality of the situation is just undeniable, broken or not broken.
It is comforting, in a strange way.
Yeah.
We like things to be visible.
Oh, for sure. We
Yeah.
want the proof right in front of our eyes.
We like them to be easily categorized.
Mm,
And most of all, we like to have a very clear point of origin.
right.
When a physical bone breaks, you can identify the specific moment of impact, the angle of the stress, and the specific location to the fracture. You can point right to the origin of the pain.
But then you step into the world of human nature, ethics, and theology, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely useless.
It really is. The picture gets totally blurred.
Yeah, we are looking at a diagnostic landscape regarding the human condition that is entirely murky. We look at the state of the world, the reality of death, the presence of wrongdoing, and we ask, where did this all come from?
The big question.
Right. What is the root cause of this universal malfunction? We all intuitively know that something is drastically wrong with the world, but pinpointing the genesis of that wrongness is a massive philosophical challenge.
Determining the actual origin point of humanity's brokenness is a huge undertaking. I mean, for centuries, theologians, philosophers, and historians have tried to isolate the specific moment the human condition fractured.
They want that clear x-ray.
Well, precisely. They're searching for the etiology of sin and death.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into an incredibly dense, highly academic theological study to look into this.
It's going to be a heavy one.
Yes, it is. We are going to conduct a very close reading and analysis of Felipe de Jesús Legarreta-Castillo's 2014 book, The Figure of Adam, in Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15.
And our mission for this analysis is to unpack the Apostle Paul's theological contrast between Adam and Christ.
Specifically focusing on the dense argumentation found in Romans 5.1-21.
It is a remarkable, challenging text. We are going to look thoroughly at the Greek grammar, the historical Jewish context that Paul was drawing from, the concept of federal headship, and the ethical demands this specific text places on the listener today.
Legarreta-Castillo provides an exceptionally detailed grammatical analysis that, quite honestly, forces us to rethink how we read these ancient texts.
Oh, without a doubt, it shakes up a lot of assumptions.
Now, if you are driving to work right now or listening while getting ready for your day, you know that trying to read the Apostle Paul can sometimes feel like translating a dense legal contract.
You get totally lost in these long, winding sentences full of just as and so also.
Right. It can be really confusing. But understanding the mechanics of what Paul is doing here, specifically, how he argues that one man's actions dictate the legal and spiritual status of all humanity, radically alters how you view your own daily life.
It changes how you process guilt, how you view your own ethical choices, and how you understand your standing before God.
So to really grasp what is happening in this text, we have to start by looking at where it sits within the larger framework of Paul's letter to the Romans.
We cannot isolate Romans 5 from its surrounding arguments. We need to place it within the massive theological structure Paul is building.
Let us establish that context. If you read Romans chapters 1-4, Paul is making a very specific, airtight legal case.
He acts as a prosecuting attorney, bringing all of humanity into a cosmic courtroom.
Yeah, he systematically proves that both Jew and Gentile are under the wrath of God. No one has an excuse. Everyone is entirely guilty, lacking any intrinsic righteousness.
He spends 4 entire chapters dismantling any sense of self-righteousness anyone might have.
He quotes the Psalms, insisting that no one is righteous, not even one.
Right. He establishes that the entire world is held accountable to God. Then he introduces justification by faith alone, using Abraham as the prime example.
Okay, so that is chapters 1-4. And then if you look ahead to chapters 6-8, the topic shifts entirely.
Paul is suddenly talking about walking in the Spirit, the newness of life, the internal war with the flesh, and the ultimate glorification of the believer.
So Romans 5 is the bridge between these two massive realities. But among scholars, there is a very intense debate about the structural placement of this specific passage, Romans 5.1-21.
Yeah, the scholarly debate is fascinating.
Does it close the previous argument or does it open the next one?
Well, some scholars, like Ulrich Wilkins, view Romans 5 as the grand conclusion to the previous
The
themes.
finale, basically.
Precisely. In his view, Paul's been talking about justification by faith, and Romans 5 is the final, undisputed peak of that entire line of reasoning.
Wilkins argues that Paul is wrapping up the argument about how we are justified despite our status under wrath.
Yes, showing that the justification secured by Christ comprehensively answers the condemnation earned by Adam.
So Wilkins sees it as the period at the end of the sentence for chapters 1 through 4. It seals the legal argument.
But on the other side, you have scholars like Thomas Tobin and Jean-Noel Aleti.
Right, they see it differently.
They argue that Romans 5 is actually the introduction to the next major section. They point out that Romans 5 introduces the superabounding grace and life brought by Christ.
Which sets the entire basis for chapters 6, 7, and 8, where Paul explains what life in the Spirit actually looks like in practice.
Tobin and Aleti focus heavily on the introduction of life as a theological concept. Up until chapter 5, Paul is primarily discussing forensic justification.
Meaning, being declared legally righteous.
Right. But in chapter 5, he introduces life, peace, and the love of God poured into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. This vocabulary bridges directly into chapter 8.
And then you have Richard J. Erickson, who offers a perspective that Legarreta-Castillo highlights in his work.
Erickson describes Romans 5.1-20 as the pivot point of the entire letter.
The pivot point. I love that phrasing. If this passage is the pivot, it means everything Paul writes before it and everything he writes after it relies entirely on the successful comparison he makes here between Adam and Christ.
The entire weight of the letter rests on this one structural fulcrum.
The structural fulcrum is a brilliant way to describe it.
If the logic of Romans 5 fails, the entire letter collapses.
It makes me think of like a structural hinge on a massive, heavy oak door. Imagine you were walking through an old cathedral.
Okay, I am picturing it.
You have chapters 1 through 4, which represent this dark, heavy room of legal prosecution, wrath, and undeniable human guilt.
Very bleak.
Extremely bleak. And you want to get into the next room, chapters 6 through 8, which is flooded with life in the Spirit, freedom from condemnation, adoption as children of God.
But you cannot simply teleport from the courtroom of wrath into the freedom of the Spirit.
No, you have to walk through the doorway.
And that door requires a mechanism to swing open.
A heavy iron mechanism. You cannot properly appreciate the new room you are entering without looking closely at the hinge that swings that massive door open.
That hinge is the contract between Adam and Christ.
Yeah. It is the mechanism that swings you completely out of the old room of condemnation and into the new room of life. The hinge transfers you from one reality to another.
And if that hinge breaks, the door stays shut.
Wow. Yeah.
The theology of justification in chapters 1 through 4 has no universal resolution, and the ethics of chapters 6 through 8 have no solid basis.
If Christ does not act as a new federal head for humanity, replacing the old headship of Adam, then there is no mechanism to transfer believers from wrath to grace.
This means we have to look very closely at the materials Paul used to forge that hinge.
We have to look at the pre-existing traditions and the cultural backdrop he was working with, specifically regarding the figure of Adam.
Because when we think of Adam, we immediately go to Genesis chapter 3.
Oh, always. We picture the garden, the tree, the snake, the fruit, and the immediate exile from Eden.
But Legarreta-Castillo points out a rather startling fact about Genesis 3.
It is a fact that catches many people completely off guard.
Yeah, when you read the actual narrative of Genesis 3, it details Adam eating the fruit, and it details God pronouncing a curse on the serpent, the woman, and the ground.
God declares that Adam will return to dust.
But the text of Genesis actually never explicitly states that Adam's sin passed biological or spiritual death to all his descendants.
Wait, it doesn't.
It really doesn't. It never makes the direct, systematic claim that sin and death became a hereditary condition passed down to every single human being solely because of that one isolated moment.
The idea that Adam's sin infected the entire human race with a terminal disease of death is not explicitly written out in the grammar of Genesis 3.
I think many listeners would find that surprising because we are so conditioned to read Genesis 3 through the lens of Romans 5.
Right, we read Paul backwards into Moses. But if we isolate the Genesis text, the mechanics of original sin are not clearly defined there.
They are not. Genesis establishes the historical event of the first disobedience and the subsequent expulsion from the garden, but it does not provide a comprehensive theological treatise on the transmission of original sin to billions of future people.
Then where's Paul getting this incredibly developed concept?
That is the big question Legarreta-Castillo tackles.
Because Romans 5 is built entirely on the idea that through one man, death entered the entire world. If Paul did not get the systematic mechanics from Genesis 3, where did he find the theological vocabulary to construct this argument?
Paul is pulling from early Jewish apocalyptic traditions.
Okay, set the scene for us there.
During the centuries leading up to the First Century, particularly the Second Temple period, Jewish thinkers were grappling intensely with the reality of a broken world.
They were looking at the exile of Israel, the suffering under foreign empires like Babylon, Greece, and Rome, and the inescapable reality of death.
Exactly. They were reading Genesis and they started connecting the theological dots. Legarreta-Castillo points out that Paul was highly aware of these traditions and utilized their vocabulary.
What specific texts are we talking about here? I was reading through some of these apocryphal and pseudepigraphal texts before we recorded, and they are fascinating.
The specific writings from that era include 4 Ezra, 2 Baruch, the Liber Antiquitatum Biblicarum, which is also known as Pseudo-Philo, and the Life of Adam and Eve.
Okay, I was actually reading The Life of Adam and Eve, and I was absolutely shocked by how the author portrays the dynamic between the first couple.
It is pretty intense, isn't it?
Yes. In that text, it claims that death was one of 70 plagues sent by God as a punishment because Adam and Eve forsook God's covenant.
Yeah.
But the wild part is that Adam completely throws Eve under the bus. He explicitly blames Eve for bringing wrath and destruction to all humanity.
It is this intense, almost desperate attempt to find a clear scapegoat for universal human suffering. The Life of Adam and Eve provides a very clear look into how Jewish thinkers were attempting to trace the universal problem of death back to that specific event in the garden.
They were trying to build the bridge between the ancient narrative and their present suffering.
If you look at 4 Ezra, the author goes even further. He traces the universal fall of humanity back to what he calls the evil heart, or the evil root.
The evil root.
Yeah, he explicitly states that Adam's transgression brought permanent death, not just for him, but for all his descendants who inherited that evil root.
They are actively interpreting Genesis to answer the massive geopolitical and personal questions about human suffering.
They're watching their nation get conquered, they're watching their children die of disease, and they're asking, why is the fabric of reality so hostile to us?
And their focus was intensely eschatological. Since these Jewish authors were operating with a heavily eschatological focus, they were looking at the end of the world to explain the beginning.
That is right. They were trying to explain why the world was so completely shattered right now, while simultaneously anticipating a future new creation where God would vindicate the righteous.
They wanted to know how the story ends, and to do that, they had to understand the precise mechanics of how the story broke in the first place.
It is like trying to diagnose a massive failure in a civic water grid.
Oh, that is a good analogy.
You have millions of people getting sick, and the engineers have to trace the contaminated water all the way back through hundreds of miles of pipes to find the specific reservoir that was initially poisoned.
These apocalyptic writers were tracing the contamination of death back to Adam.
Paul adopts this pre-existing Jewish framework. He agrees with the apocalyptic writers that Adam is the poisoned reservoir.
But here is the crucial departure. The Jewish writers were heavily focused on Adam's ruin.
They spent all their theological energy lamenting the brokenness caused by the first man.
Paul takes that framework and shifts the spotlight entirely away from Adam's ruin and focuses it blindingly on Christ's victory.
He uses the tragedy of Adam just as a dark backdrop to highlight the blinding brilliance of the second Adam.
Wait, I cannot fully buy that without raising a major complication.
What is the complication?
If the culture universally blamed Adam, that makes sense. But the Jewish texts were not a monolith. I was looking at the notes on the text of 2 Baruch, specifically chapter 54, verse 19.
Ah, yes.
The author writes, Adam is not the cause, except for himself, but each of us has become our own Adam.
That is a stunning, disruptive quote.
It really is. It basically says, stop blaming the guy in the garden. You are making your own terrible choices. You are earning your own death.
It champions radical personal responsibility.
So my question is, how can Paul justify blaming one man for the status of the entire human race when highly respected Jewish scholars of his own era were arguing that every single person acts as their own Adam?
It is a fair question.
How does Paul synthesize this idea of intense personal responsibility with his argument about universal federal headship? That feels like a massive contradiction that Jewish scholars would have ripped apart.
That is the core tension of the passage. And it brings us to the complex theological concept of primary versus secondary causality.
Okay, primary versus secondary.
Right. Paul is dealing with two simultaneous truths that seem contradictory, but actually function together to explain the totality of human guilt.
Break down primary and secondary causality for us in this specific context.
Think of primary causality as the initial breach in the containment system. Adam is the primary cause.
Got it.
His action violated the covenant. He introduced the reality of sin and death into the human environment. Before Adam, the environment was sterile. After Adam, the environment was permanently toxic. That is the primary cause. Adam ruined the ecosystem.
And the secondary causality.
The secondary causality is the fact that every single human being born into that toxic ecosystem actively chooses to participate in it.
We breathe the toxic air and we willingly exhale it.
We validate Adam's choice with our own daily rebellion. Paul's not denying personal responsibility. In fact, he requires it for his argument to hold weight.
He is saying Adam opened the door, but every single one of us gladly sprints through it.
We are not innocent victims of Adam's choice. We are active co-conspirators who ratify his rebellion with our own actions.
So it is a simultaneous reality. Adam caused the initial infection, but we are all actively spreading it through our own volition.
You cannot claim innocence because our actions mirror his. We are our own Adam, but we only have the capacity to act like Adam because he first corrupted the nature we inherit.
Wow, okay. This concept of primary and secondary causality leads us perfectly into the actual grammatical mechanics of how Paul explains the entrance of death in Romans 5.
Specifically, the highly contested grammar of verse 12.
Let us examine the grammar, because verse 12 is arguably one of the most debated sentences in all of theological history.
It really has caused a lot of arguments over the centuries.
Paul writes, "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people." And then there is a tiny phrase at the end of the verse that has caused all this debate.
The Greek phrase is if ho.
F-ho. I want to bring some church history into this, because the translation of those two small Greek words literally shaped Western civilization.
It is incredible how two words can do that.
When Jerome translated the Greek New Testament into the Latin Vulgate, he translated f-ho as in quo, which means in whom.
And that specific Latin translation became the bedrock for Augustine's theology of original sin.
Yes. Augustine read the Latin in quo and argued that all humanity was literally, biologically, and legally present in the loins of Adam when he sinned.
Therefore, we literally sinned in him.
Augustine used this to battle Pelagius, who argued that humans are born essentially neutral and only become sinners by imitating Adam.
Augustine said, no, we are born guilty because we were physically present in whom the sin occurred.
The historical irony, of course, is that Augustine did not read Greek proficiently.
He built a massive theological fortress on a highly questionable Latin translation.
Right, because the Greek phrase f-ho does not naturally mean in whom.
Which brings us back to Legarreta-Castillo's analysis.
So what is the actual grammatical debate surrounding the Greek phrase f-ho if it does not mean in whom?
Well, scholars debate whether f-ho functions as a relative clause or a consecutive clause.
Okay, what is the difference there?
If it is a consecutive clause, it implies a strict result. Death came to all men with the result that all sinned.
It makes our sinning an unavoidable mechanical result of death.
But Legarreta-Castillo aligns with the majority of modern scholarship, interpreting it as a relative clause expressing a basis or a condition.
So how does he translate it?
He translates F as on the basis that.
So the sentence properly reads, death came to all men on the basis that all sinned.
Yes. It ties right back to our discussion about causality.
Well, it makes so much sense.
Paul views both Adam's initial breach and the ongoing active sins of humanity as dual reasons for death's reign.
Adam's disobedience occupies a prominent place as the first transgression, the primary cause that plunged the world into ruin.
But the undeniable fact that all individuals subsequently sinned is the secondary cause that validates and maintains the reign of death.
Death comes to everyone on the basis that everyone actively sins.
To prove just how devastating and pervasive Adam's primary action was, Paul introduces a historical parenthesis in verses 13 and 14.
He pauses the main argument to talk about the era from Adam to Moses.
He brings in this massive stretch of ancient history to prove a specific point about the nature of sin and the tyranny of death.
The time before the Mosaic Law was given on Mount Sinai, Paul points out a historical reality. During that huge expanse of time from Adam to Moses, there was no written law.
There were no stone tablets explicitly detailing moral boundaries.
There was no Levitical code.
And according to strict Jewish legal thought at the time, sin is not taken into account while there is no law.
That was a widely accepted legal axiom. You cannot be charged with a crime if the penal code defining that crime has not been written yet.
A judge cannot sentence you for breaking a law that does not exist.
But Paul points to the undeniable, gruesome evidence of human history. People were still dying.
Every single person who lived between Adam and Moses ended up in a grave.
Paul writes that death reigned like a supreme monarch from Adam to Moses.
Death sat on the throne, executing humanity without exception, even over those who did not sin in the exact same manner as Adam.
Adam broke a direct, explicit, verbal command from God. God told him, do not eat from this tree.
The people living between Adam and Moses did not have a direct, explicit, codified command in the same way. They did not have the Torah.
Yet they still died.
Which proves that the infection from Adam was universal, organic, and lethal, regardless of whether a legal code existed to formally define it.
The absence of the Torah did not grant them immunity from the curse of Adam.
How do we visualize that reality? How do we understand the lethal force operating without a defining law?
I think the most accurate way to understand this is to picture a massive, lethal, radioactive leak at a nuclear power plant.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a catastrophic breach happens in a facility near a populated town, and invisible radiation floods the surrounding atmosphere. Now imagine this happens decades before anyone has invented Geiger counters to measure the exact severity of the radiation.
There is no instrument, no formal metric, no scientific law to register or define the invisible danger in the air.
Precisely. So there is no law to measure the breach. The radiation exists, but the metric to quantify it does not.
I see where you're going with this.
But the absence of a measuring device does not negate the lethal reality of the environment. People in the town are still getting sick. People are still dying of radiation poisoning.
The invisible toxin is actively killing people, whether they have the technology to measure it or not.
Adam caused the nuclear meltdown in the garden. And even before Moses came along centuries later with the Geiger counter, which is the law to show everyone how much radiation was in the air, death was already reigning supreme.
The environment Adam created was fundamentally lethal from day one.
That analogy really captures the historical parenthesis. It shows that sin is not just a series of broken rules. It is a toxic atmosphere that guarantees death.
We have thoroughly established the catastrophic reality of Adam's action. The hinge of the door is rusted, heavy, and stained with the consequence of universal death.
But Romans 5 is the pivot point of the letter. Paul does not leave his readers stranded in the radioactive town.
No, he immediately introduces Christ to resolve the crisis.
But here is the fascinating twist. Paul does not introduce Christ as a mere equivalent to Adam. He does not present them as equal opposing forces.
This is where we move into verses 15 through 17, and Paul's rhetoric shifts dramatically. He employs a very specific rhetorical device here known in Greco-Roman literature as synkrisis.
Synkrisis, a formal speech of comparison often used by Roman orators to weigh two subjects against each other.
Yes, but Paul is utilizing a very specific, aggressive form of synkrisis. He is arguing a minori ad maius.
From the lesser to the greater. If a small thing has a certain effect, a much larger thing will have an infinitely greater effect.
The comparison Paul builds between Adam and Christ is fiercely asymmetrical. They are not equals on a cosmic playing field.
The text underscores a heavy, almost rhythmic wordplay in the Greek to make this point absolutely unavoidable. Paul repeatedly uses words ending with the suffix ma to contrast the actions and the results.
I was looking at the Greek text for this section, and it almost sounds like a poetic chant when you read it aloud.
Let's hear the words.
He talks about the paraptoma, which is the trespass, the falling away, and he contrasts it with the kerygma, the grace, and the diorema, the free gift.
And he contrasts the kerygma, the resulting condemnation, with the dikaioma, the righteous requirement, or the act of justification.
Paraptoma, kerygma, diorema, kerygma, dikaioma. It is highly sophisticated rhetoric designed to hammer the contrast into the listener's mind.
And running straight through this wordplay, acting as the engine of the argument, is the repeated phrase polomelon.
Much more.
Much more. Legarreta-Castillo points out a significant scholarly debate surrounding these verses.
A scholar named Christ C. Kerygma theorized that verses 15 and 16 are actually functioning as rhetorical questions, implying that the free gift operates exactly like the trespass.
In Kerygma's reading, Paul is essentially asking, does not the gift work in the exact same mathematical way as the sin?
Kerygma is arguing for a perfectly balanced equation. -1 on the Adam side, +1 on the Christ side.
Adam subtracted humanity from God. Christ added humanity back to God. A zero-sum game.
Yes. But the expert analysis provided by Legarreta-Castillo, following the rigorous work of Jean-Noël Aleti, strongly refutes that balanced equation reading.
Aleti clarifies that the differences utterly eclipse the similarities. It is not a balanced equation at all.
Think about the mathematics of what is happening. One single trespass from one man brought death to everyone. That is a devastating multiplication of consequence from a single action.
But the grace of Christ does not just absorb that one initial trespass.
It absorbs the original trespass, plus many trespasses, billions of individual sins committed across the entirety of human history.
And it still has enough residual force to bring absolute, abundant life.
This absolutely obliterates an image that a lot of us grew up with.
Oh, you mean the Sunday school illustration?
Yes, in Sunday school or youth group, teachers often use a visual of a balanced scale to explain justification.
Right. You have an old brass scale, and on one side, Adam's sin drops onto the plate. The scale slams down to the side of death and judgment.
Then to fix the problem, Jesus' righteousness is dropped onto the other plate, and it perfectly balances the scale back to neutral. It brings humanity back to ground zero.
It is an incredibly common illustration used to simplify the concept of atonement.
But based on what Paul is arguing with the phrase polomal and much more, that scale analogy is fundamentally flawed. It misrepresents the sheer volume of grace.
Break down why the scale analogy fails.
The text does not describe a seesaw where Christ simply balances out Adam to reach a state of neutrality.
If we stick to the scale imagery, it is like Adam's sin is a dense, heavy pebble placed on one side of the scale.
The scale drops because the pebble carries the weight of universal death.
But Christ's righteousness is not just another pebble placed on the opposite side to balance it out.
Christ's righteousness is a massive, towering mountain dropped onto the other side of the scale.
The mountain does not just balance the scale, it annihilates the scale entirely.
The grace shatters the measuring mechanism because it is so overwhelmingly superior to the trespass.
It does not just restore humanity to Eden, it elevates humanity to a glorified state that Adam never possessed.
That is the pure essence of the a minori ad maius argument.
If the pebble Adam's single disobedience had the capacity to cause universal death, how much more does the mountain Christ's perfect obedience and sacrificial death have the capacity to secure eternal life?
Adam is the finite lesser. Christ is the infinite greater.
We have established the absolute superiority of the gift. The mountain destroys the pebble. The grace vastly outscales the sin.
But that brings up a highly mechanical question.
How does this much more actually transfer to massive groups of people? If Christ wins so decisively, how do individuals thousands of years later get swept up in that victory?
That structural question transitions us perfectly into verses 18 and 19.
Where Paul gets to the absolute heart of corporate solidarity, the intricate legal and spiritual relationship between the one and the many.
Let us examine verses 18 and 19 closely. Paul sets up two parallel sets of antitheses here to explain the mechanics of transfer.
First, he contrasts one transgression leading to universal condemnation with one act of righteousness leading to universal justification.
Second, he contrasts the direct disobedience of one man with the direct obedience of one man.
Legarreta-Castillo highlights the specific verbs and their tenses in these verses, which is a subtle detail, but it carries immense theological weight.
The verb tenses tell a highly significant theological story about the timing of our redemption.
Look at verse 19. Paul writes that through Adam's disobedience, the many were made sinners.
Past tense.
Past tense. It is a completed action in history. It is a fixed, inherited status. The verdict was handed down.
But then he looks at Christ's obedience and writes that through it, the many will be made righteous.
Future tense.
Future tense. This future tense indicates an eschatological reality.
The full, final realization of this righteousness, the complete eradication of death, the glorification of the physical body, that is an event that is legally secured now but will be fully realized in the future consummation of the kingdom.
There is also some fascinating terminology regarding exactly who is affected by these two men.
He talks about all men in verse 18, and then he switches to the many in verse 19.
The Greek phrase used in verse 19 is oi polloi, which translates to the many.
It is vital to understand that in the ancient Greco-Roman and Jewish world, the many did not mean a large percentage, but not quite everyone.
It was a collective, inclusive term representing the entire group attached to a specific head. This is the ancient concept of corporate solidarity.
Corporate solidarity. We need to spend some serious time dissecting this concept because I think this is where modern readers hit a massive brick wall.
Why do you view it as a brick wall for modern readers?
Think about the average listener living in a highly individualized Western culture. From the moment we are born, we are saturated in the philosophy of extreme individualism.
We are taught that we are autonomous agents.
I am solely responsible for my choices, and you are solely responsible for your choices. My destiny is entirely in my own hands, shaped by my own merit.
The idea that someone else's action thousands of years ago defines my legal and spiritual status before God feels offensive to the modern mind.
It feels like a violation of our personal autonomy.
It creates immense friction because it challenges the core doctrine of Western individualism.
How do we, as modern people, begin to understand this ancient framework of corporate representation? How do we grasp the idea of one person legally redefining the status of billions?
In Protestant theology, particularly within the framework of the Westminster Confession, this is known as federal headship.
Adam acted as the federal head of humanity under a covenant of works. When he failed, the entire constituency he represented failed with him.
Christ acts as the new federal head under a covenant of grace. When he succeeds, his constituency succeeds with him.
To understand this outside of strict theological terms, we have to look at how legal representation and headship actually operate, even in our modern world.
Think about a head of state. If a president or a prime minister signs a treaty declaring war on another nation, the entire citizenry of that nation is instantly at war.
Even if I, as an individual citizen, was completely unaware, perhaps asleep in my bed when the document was signed.
Your personal awareness, your individual consent, or your personal actions in that specific moment do not alter your legal status.
Your representative acted on your behalf, and you inherit the consequences of that action.
The ancient world understood this implicitly. The Romans had the concept of the paterfamilias, the head of the household.
The legal and social standing of the paterfamilias was the exact standing of everyone in the household, slaves, children, and relatives.
Corporate solidarity viewed humanity not as a bucket full of separate, disconnected grains of sand, but as an enormous tree.
The health of the root dictates the health of every single branch. Adam was the designated head, the root. His action legally and organically redefined the entire human group attached to him.
So, relying on the verb tenses from earlier, through his disobedience, the many were made sinners.
We were plunged into a state of war with God because our representative declared war.
But the breathtaking turn in Paul's argument is that God does not leave humanity to rot with a dead root.
God establishes a new head, a new root. Christ acts as the final supreme representative.
By his perfect obedience, specifically his expiatory death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead, he signs a new treaty of peace.
And everyone who is attached to him by faith, the new oipoloi, the new many, are legally redefined.
They are transferred to a new tree. They will be made righteous.
It is a massive structural transfer of power. We are talking about cosmic headship. Adam ruined the first creation. Christ secures the new creation.
It is the most significant transfer of status in the universe.
But if we connect this cosmic transfer to the bigger picture of the biblical narrative, it raises a glaring, unavoidable question.
If the entire story of redemption is essentially a tale of two men, Adam and Christ, if Adam's headship was the origin of the disaster and Christ's headship guarantees the overwhelming victory, what do we do with the Old Testament?
Specifically, why does the Old Testament spend massive amounts of time focusing heavily on the Mosaic Law?
That is the logical next question any Jewish reader in the first century would ask.
If it is all about Adam and Christ, what was the point of Mount Sinai? What was the purpose of the Ten Commandments, the complex Levitical codes, the sacrifices, and the dietary restrictions?
Did God waste centuries focusing on a legal code that could not fix the Adam problem?
Paul anticipates that exact question, and his answer in verses 20 and 21 is, frankly, provocative.
It borders on scandalous for a Jewish audience.
It was highly controversial when he wrote it, and it remains striking to read today. Paul writes, "The law slipped in so that the trespass might increase."
The law slipped in. That phrasing sounds almost subversive.
It demotes the law from the center of the universe to a side project.
The Greek verb Paul uses is periselthen. It implies coming in alongside, or slipping in as a secondary addition.
It implies that the law was never the main event.
The main event was the promise given to Abraham and the ultimate fulfillment of that promise in Christ. The law was a temporary secondary addition designed to manage the time between the promise and the fulfillment.
Legarreta-Castillo connects Romans 5.20 to what Paul wrote earlier in his highly combative letter to the Galatians, specifically Galatians 3.19.
Yes. In Galatians, Paul is battling false teachers who want to force Gentile converts to obey the Mosaic law.
Paul asks the same rhetorical question, why then the law? And his answer is that it was added because of transgressions.
In Galatians, he uses the term pedagogos to describe the function of the law.
A pedagogos, explain what that role entailed in the ancient world.
In the Greco-Roman world, a pedagogos was a custodian, often a trusted slave, who was put in charge of a minor.
They were not the father of the child, but they were strict disciplinarians who managed the child's behavior, escorted them to school, and corrected them with physical discipline until the child reached full legal maturity.
Paul is saying the law was this strict custodian. It was meant to lock humanity up, restrict our behavior, and guard us until Christ, the true maturity, arrived.
But Paul says in Romans 5 that the law slipped in so that the trespass might increase. That is the part that scrambles the brain.
You would assume a strict custodian is there to decrease bad behavior.
You would logically think God gave the Ten Commandments to stop people from sinning, to make the world a better place.
This is where we have to grasp the highly specific diagnostic function of the law in Paul's theology.
Legarreta-Castillo points out that the law actually aroused covetousness. Paul details this psychological phenomenon extensively later in Romans chapter 7.
He basically argues, I would not have known what it meant to covet if the law had not explicitly said, you shall not covet.
But once the command was given, the dormant sin inside him seized the opportunity and produced every conceivable kind of coveting.
It is the inescapable psychology of the do not touch sign.
You walk past a vet park bench and you have absolutely no desire to touch it. It does not even cross your mind.
But the second you see a bright yellow sign that says, wet paint, do not touch, every rebellious fiber of your being wants to reach out and poke the bench.
The sign did not create the wet paint, and the sign did not create your internal rebellion. Your rebellion was already there.
But the sign provoked your latent rebellion into a visible, measurable, undeniable trespass.
The law took the ambient and visible radiation of sin that we discussed earlier and made it highly visible and legally actionable. It actively made humanity accountable.
Let me try another analogy here to see if it fully captures what Paul is saying about the law increasing the trespass.
All right.
Think of a high-definition magnifying glass. Imagine you are looking at a kitchen counter that looks relatively clean to the naked eye. You might think, this is fine. I do not need to clean this. I can prepare food here.
But then someone hands you a massive, highly powerful magnifying glass.
You hold it over the surface, and suddenly you see thousands of microscopic mites, dangerous bacteria, and layers of accumulated grime.
The surface was always filthy. The bacteria were always present.
Right. The magnifying glass did not manufacture the dirt. It did not create the bacteria. But it drastically increased the visibility of the dirt.
It enlarged the trespass. It proved to the observer, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the counter is toxic and that they desperately need a powerful cleansing agent.
The law is the magnifying glass. It shows us the microscopic reality of our own depravity.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize the diagnostic function of the law. The law increased the visible trespass so that the absolute, undeniable necessity of grace would become obvious.
It forces humanity to stop pretending the counter is clean.
Which brings us back to the monarchs we talked about earlier in the historical parenthesis.
Yes, Paul personifies sin and death as these ruling, tyrannical monarchs who held all of humanity hostage. They set up their global kingdom through Adam's initial breach.
And the law comes in, shines a massive, glaring spotlight on the kingdom of sin, and shows humanity how utterly enslaved they are to these monarchs.
Exactly. The law increases the trespass, making the slavery visible. But, and here is the massive climax of the chapter in verse 20, where sin increased, grace superabounded.
The Greek word Paul uses there is absolutely incredible. Hyperaperisison.
Hyperreperisous. It is a hyperabundance. It is an overflowing, unrestrained, catastrophic flood of grace.
It is grace that breaks the banks of the river and floods the entire plain.
This superabounding grace completely dethrones sin and death and establishes its own permanent reign.
Paul writes in verse 21 that just as sin reigned in death, so also grace might reign through righteousness to bring eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord.
It is a grand cosmic shift of power. The old monarchs of sin and death are violently deposed. The new king has taken the throne.
The era of Adam is officially over, and the era of Christ has begun.
And that cosmic shift of power sets the foundational reality for everything that follows in the letter. We have finally walked through the heavy door.
The hinge of the Adam and Christ comparison has swung us completely out of the dark courtroom of wrath and placed us firmly in the sunlight of grace.
Which brings us to the immediate, highly practical question.
We have spent an enormous amount of time in the dense theological stratosphere today. We have analyzed ancient Jewish apocalyptic texts, Greek verb tenses, rhetorical structures, and the cosmic reality of federal headship.
But what does this actually mean for the listener tomorrow morning? How does hyperprecision alter a Tuesday at the office?
Theology is most valuable when it lands firmly on the ground. We have to bring this abstract cosmic theology down to the street level of daily human experience.
If it does not change how we live, we have missed Paul's point entirely.
Legarreta-Castillo insists that this Adam and Christ contrast provides the entire ethical basis for the new life described in Romans chapters 6 through 8.
Justification is not just a legal fiction. It is the genesis of sanctification.
Yes. We briefly mentioned the already not yet tension earlier when we talked about the future tense of being made righteous.
Believers stand in grace now. They are legally justified now. The power of sin as a reigning monarch dictating their eternal destiny is broken now.
But the final glorification, eternal life, the full redemption of the physical body, and the restoration of the physical world is still a future reality.
The not yet, the waiting period.
Right. So we live our entire lives in this middle space. We are living between the inauguration of the new kingdom at the resurrection and its final consummation at the second coming.
And because we live in this tense middle space, the superabounding grace we have received initiates a total, radical alteration of the believer's daily behavior.
It is not a license to sit back, relax, and keep sinning because grace will cover it. Paul literally screams, by no means, at that idea in chapter 6.
Far from it. In Romans chapter 6, Paul argues that grace demands a radical, violent break from the old way of life.
He points to the physical act of baptism. He says that in baptism, believers are spiritually and symbolically inserted into Christ's death and resurrection.
We die to the old monarch, sin, and we are raised from the water to serve the new monarch, grace.
Legarreta-Castillo highlights an argument from a scholar named Christian Grapp. Grapp notes that the figure of Adam practically haunts chapters 5 through 7.
Adam is the ghost in the machine. He is the lingering shadow.
Yes. Adam represents the old man, the old self, the old creation that must be continuously, daily put to death by the believer.
Because we have been transferred to the headship of Christ, Paul issues a strict command. Do not let sin reign in your mortal bodies. Do not obey the ghost of Adam.
It is a severe ethical demand. If you are listening to this right now, this is where the rubber meets the road.
Knowing that you are under the headship of Christ is not just a mental trivia fact to file away in your brain.
It is not just a theological puzzle to solve for intellectual satisfaction.
It is a total legal transfer of citizenship.
A complete transfer. Imagine you used to live in a tyrannical, oppressive country where the water was poisoned, the air was toxic, and the dictator forced you into hard labor.
That was the kingdom of Adam.
But someone secured your rescue, paid your ransom, and you were given a brand new passport to a vibrant, healthy, free nation. That is the kingdom of Christ.
And the ethical demand is this. You cannot cross the border into the new nation and continue living according to the customs, habits, and fears of the old kingdom.
You now hold a passport to the new kingdom. Act like a citizen of the new kingdom.
You cannot go back and drink the poisoned water. You belong to a new head.
This legal reality demands a totally altered daily walk. It changes how you speak to your spouse in the middle of an argument, how you handle your finances, how you view your career ambitions, and how you respond to physical suffering.
Your ethical choices are no longer driven by the anxiety, pride, and selfishness of the old Adamic nature.
They are driven by the security and the superabounding grace of your new representative, Christ.
Because the burden of securing your eternal status has been handled entirely by the much more of Christ, you are finally free to actually live a holy life.
Let us unpack this even further, because the connection between the cosmic theology of Romans 5 and the practical, lived-out ethics of Romans 6, 7, and 8 is critical for daily survival.
Legarreta-Castillo talks about how believers must remain in this grace.
What does the daily practice of remaining in grace actually look like when you are sitting in traffic or dealing with a difficult coworker?
According to Paul, it starts with a fundamental psychological shift in how you reckon your own identity.
In Romans 6:11, Paul writes, "Consider yourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus."
The Greek word for consider is logizomai. It is a strict accounting term. It means to calculate it as an undeniable fact, to put it in the ledger.
You look at the ledger of your life and you see that the massive debt accumulated by Adam and your own secondary causality has been zeroed out and infinite capital has been deposited by Christ.
Exactly. You are calculating your reality based on Christ's perfect obedience, not Adam's catastrophic disobedience.
And because that calculation is a mathematical and legal fact, you have the actual strength to obey the command in the next verse. Do not let sin reign in your mortal body.
Sin is no longer a reigning monarch. It is a defeated enemy trying to mount a desperate insurgency in your daily habits.
An insurgency, I like that word for this concept. It acknowledges that the fight is not over.
The war is won. Christ comprehensively defeated death and sin on the cross. But there's still brutal skirmishes happening in our daily lives. There are still ambushes.
Yes, the already not yet tension is an active battlefield. We are waiting for the final consummation.
We are waiting for the phrase, will be made righteous, to reach its absolute visible physical zenith.
But right now, today, we fight the insurgency of the old man, the Adamic nature that Christian Grapp says haunts these chapters.
How does the law factor into this daily fight against the insurgency? Because Paul explicitly says in chapter 6 that sin does not rule over you, for you are not under the law but under grace.
This is where Paul clarifies the function of the law in the life of the justified believer, which he expands on heavily in chapter 7.
If you are trying to defeat the insurgency of sin by relying on the law, by just staring intently at the Ten Commandments and trying really hard to obey them in your own natural strength, you will absolutely fail.
Because the law is just the magnifying glass. It only shows you the bacteria. It has no chemical ability to scrub the counter clean.
Precisely. The law, as Paul says, was weak because it relied on human flesh to carry it out.
And the human flesh is heavily infected by the Adamic condition. So if you are living under the law, you are relying on broken equipment to fix a broken reality.
You are trying to clean up the radioactive spill using a sponge made of the exact same radioactive material. You are just spreading the radiation around.
That is a stark image, but it captures the sheer futility Paul describes in Romans 7.
He cries out that the desire to do good might be present in his mind, but the ability to carry it out is completely lacking under the old Adamic framework. He finds himself doing the very evil he hates.
So what is the alternative? How do we actually walk in newness of life and defeat the insurgency if the law cannot help us?
That leads to the grand sweeping resolution in Romans 8. Paul introduces a completely new operating principle.
He says, the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death.
The Spirit of life, the third person of the Trinity, enters the argument.
Legarreta-Castillo highlights this crucial point as the culmination of the hinge. The new life is attained completely apart from the law and is empowered entirely by the Spirit.
Adam represents the old creation, dominated by sin and governed by death. Christ inaugurates the new creation.
And the way we practically experience that new creation today in the middle space is through the active indwelling of the Holy Spirit.
So the Spirit is the actual cleansing agent. The law shows the dirt, Christ secures the legal right to clean the house, and the Spirit actively does the scrubbing on a daily basis.
That is a very practical, systematic way to synthesize the entire block of Romans 5 through 8.
The ethical demands Paul places on believers to put to death the deeds of the body, to walk in love, to avoid covetousness, are only possible because we have been grafted into a new head.
And that new head has sent his Spirit to dwell inside us, giving us new desires and new strength.
It all comes back to the hinge. If Romans 5.1221 is the structural pivot point of the entire letter, as Richard Erickson argues, then every single victory, every moment of peace, and every promise of no condemnation in Romans 8 is only possible because the much more of Christ's obedience comprehensively shattered the condemnation of Adam's disobedience.
Without the asymmetrical victory detailed in Romans 5, the magnificent promises of Romans 8 are just wishful thinking. They have no legal basis.
But because the victory of the second Adam is real, the freedom of the believer is real.
We have covered massive theological ground today. We have traced the diagnostic muddy waters of the human condition all the way back to its perceived source in ancient Jewish apocalyptic thought.
We have looked closely at the complex grammatical mechanics of primary and secondary causality.
We have unpacked the immense scale-breaking reality of the asymmetrical comparison between the single trespass and the superabounding gift.
And we've brought that cosmic reality down to the street level of corporate solidarity and our daily ethical walk against the insurgency of sin.
It is a text that demands rigorous, careful study, but the payoff is an incredibly robust understanding of how God deals with humanity on a covenantal level.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week.
It builds on everything we have discussed today regarding headship and representation, but it is something you can take directly into your own personal reflections.
What is the thought?
Think back to that startling quote from Baruch that we discussed earlier. Each of us has become our own Adam.
It is a sobering quote.
Think about how intensely that ancient Jewish quote resonates with the cultural water we swim in today. Modern society constantly tells you to be your own savior.
The culture insists that you have to build your own legacy, curate your own identity, and secure your own future by the sheer force of your own willpower and hustle.
Essentially, the world is commanding you every single day to be your own Adam. It demands that you act as the supreme head of your own universe.
It is an exhausting, crushing way to live because you are constantly aware of your own failures.
It is totally exhausting because you are trying to carry a cosmic, eternal weight on mortal, fractured shoulders. You are trying to balance the scale yourself.
But if what we discussed today is true, if Christ is the final, supreme, victorious head of humanity, what happens to your daily anxieties?
What happens to your fear of failure, your stress over your legacy, or your crushing guilt over your past mistakes?
What happens when you realize the massive burden of securing your eternal status was already perfectly, fully accomplished by the obedience of the One?
You are allowed to step down from the throne of your own life and rest in the headship of Christ.
It changes your entire posture toward God and toward yourself.
It truly does. It replaces anxiety with worship. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the dense, brilliant logic of the Apostle Paul. On behalf of Reformed Thinking, we hope this analysis continues to shape your mind, comfort your conscience, and guide your daily walk. Until next time.